Hello, my name is Brian. Thanks for coming to the Supervision of Peer Workforce Conference. We have Jason Robison on next, 2:45, and his presentation will be Reducing Stigma in the Workplace, Becoming an Ally. Jason Robison is the program director at Shares, the Self-Help and Recovery Exchange. Jason serves on the board of directors for Campro and is the co-chair of the National Recovery Steering Committee. He has worked in nonprofit management for 17 years, focusing on peer services, education, recovery, housing, and health. We're going to be recording this, so if you're not comfortably on camera, just turn off your camera and your name if you want to rename yourself. We are going to have a survey, an evaluation at the end, and so I'm going to be putting a link in there, and let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and send me a message in the chat and I'll try and help you out. And if you have questions you'd like to be asked later, either raise your virtual hand or put it in the chat and I'll keep track of that. All right, thanks. Take care. Here we go.
Hello, everybody. And I have to say, I'm really never comfortable being on camera, but it kind of comes with the territory of Zoom. So it's really good to see those of you that are able to be on camera. I appreciate it. It's nice to have people in front of me when I present. So, and I am Jason Robison. I'm the Chief Program Officer for SHARE. And this is a presentation. Let me pull it up here for everybody. I'm going to stop Brian sharing and I'm going to go to our slide here. And here we go. Sorry. There we go. Let me do it this way. All right. So this is Becoming an Ally. And to give you a little background on this, stigma is insidious in our culture, in human relationships, and in many of our systems. We've seen research over the years that shows that there are gaping inequities in our criminal justice system, in our health services system, in our behavioral health system. And this training and orientation came from our supervision of the Peer Workforce Project. And one of the things that we had to address in working with LA County, working with the state of California and SAMHSA in the supervision of the peer workforce was the fact that when Mental Health Services Act was passed, part of the Mental Health Services Act in California was a stigma assessment of stigma against people with behavioral health issues across the state. And one of the things that that found was that there was more stigma within the Department of Mental Health than there was in the general population when you look at people with lived experience. And so that creates a big dilemma in bringing in a workforce whose prime orientation is lived experience into that system. So how do we deal with that? And particularly within a framework where the supervisor of peer services and peer support specialists has to become an advocate for the effectiveness of peer support services within that system. Sometimes that supervisor is going to be somebody that has experience as a peer specialist. Sometimes it's going to be somebody that lacks that experience. They might have a clinical background, and either way, they've got to be an advocate for the quality of and the efficacy of peer support and the effectiveness of the staff that they supervise on their team, their peer specialists, in a system that's likely to other their program and the work of peer specialists and treat peer specialists in that system as other. So we came up with a training, and one of the things that we use, this title, Becoming an Ally, it comes from the Southern Poverty Law Center and their efforts to deal with bias and discrimination. And when confronting bias and discrimination, using specific techniques to strengthen relationships rather than confront unwanted behavior, which is likely to make people defensive and to deny that whatever they're doing is harmful. So I'm going to go through this, and we only have an hour. So I'm going to try and present tools that you can then take into your programs, organizations, and use beyond the scope of what I'm able to cover in an hour. This original training was over the course of a day. So we had people practicing techniques like this. We had conversations, and ideally, that's how this exists. So in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So stepping into stigma, bias is really important. I will also say that this is really important within agencies. It might be even within a peer-run agency, microaggressions happen. How do we deal with microaggressions when they happen? How, for instance, do we deal with the new hire who might be a male who treats women supervisors differently than he treats male supervisors? We've got to deal with that, okay? And this training is a way to do that. So how do we define success for an ally and becoming an ally? We have to have realistic expectations, and those expectations need to exist in a context where exploring any biases that people have is part of an organizational culture. Allowing everything to arise and expecting that things are going to come up is really important. There was a presenter earlier, one of the other presentations from LA County was from Ju Eric Lee, who is a supervisor in the LA County Peer Resource Center, who by background is a social worker and was put in charge of the Peer Resource Center, and talked about how coming into that role, he had to look at his own assumptions and lack of knowledge about what peer is and what peer work is. And it's important to ground ourselves in that kind of humility. So our goal is to build, I think, a beyond tolerance and appreciation for differences. We want to reduce the contagion of bigotry and prejudice, and we want to orient a culture organizationally that encourages people to consistently thinking about what they're saying and doing, and in a way that gives people who may experience voicelessness a voice. So we're going to talk about some kind of recent thinking about discrimination, cultural competencies that are related to isolation and alienation. We're going to look at some areas of the difference between dialogue and debate. We're going to kind of identify behaviors that specifically support dialogue. We're going to come to an understanding of what othering is and the impact of those it has those who experience othering. And we want to list the tools allies use to change behaviors so that we can help change behavior that excludes, stigmatizes, or discriminates against people. And then develop a plan to apply knowledge and skills for being an ally across all these ways. Whatever our own identity is, we may exist in, there's a concept of intersectionality of, in some ways, as a person with a mental health diagnosis, I exist in a marginalized framework. I'm also a white cisgendered male. So I exist in, a kind of a dominant framework as well. And being able to approach things in all areas of identification with humility is really important as we go through this. So the term ally is used when someone's not a member of a group being discriminated against, who supports and advocates on behalf of members of that group in an appropriate way, like not taking over, not claiming the voice of that group, but supporting in an appropriate way. Othering is a process or series of words and actions that views or treats a person or group of people as intrinsically different from an alien to oneself. So that might be the group of peers working in a system where there's stigma against people with lived experience, okay? And one of the reasons where or why a best practice in peer support is to not have one peer working in isolation on a team of people with other disciplines, is because that peer is consistently exposed to othering. So we want to be able to avoid that. So let's see here. Cultivating allies in the workplace. We want to make sure that allies are able to effectively cultivate a way of supporting people so that the overwhelming orientation of the organization is against stigma, bias, discrimination, so that people experiencing that feel supported and feel that when it happens, there is a response that is supportive. It's also often the case that in organizations, allies often outnumber people who are the ones who are the targets of discrimination. So there may be only one peer working on a team. And if that's the case, if there are 3 allies for peer services on that team, that program, that agency is going to do much better in making sure that everybody on that team is supported. So involving allies will also bring in a shift in organizational culture so that peer services, for example, are understood within their context, within their effectiveness and their outcomes, rather than through the lens of bias. Okay, let's see. We also, so how do people become allies? People begin to realize they are different from others who are discriminated against, and that those who are targets of discrimination have unique struggles. Then they realize they could be doing more to help others who are discriminated against or othered, sorry. Possible allies begin to learn more about those they seek to help and learn about privilege, referring to advantages of those belonging to so-called dominant groups in contrast to those who don't. Possible allies identify ways they might help and begin practicing these. They learn how to communicate new viewpoints to others. They begin to feel comfortable calling themselves allies and practice advocacy and support in safe environments. There are barriers to creating a culture of allies. There are anticipated negative reactions from others. Within environments that carry stigma or discrimination, there's groupthink. Sometimes people avoid conflict with other people. Allies may be afraid of being labeled as troublemakers. They may be afraid of being associated with people who are targets of discrimination. Allies may fear not knowing enough about issues confronted by those who are othered and how to be most helpful. Allies may fear that they may be seen as prejudiced. So, questions to consider. What motivates people to become active allies? What individual and environmental factors prevent supportive coworkers from becoming effective allies? What types of workplaces are most supportive of and encouraging toward being active allies? What supportive behaviors are most effective? What advocacy barriers are most effective? How can allies make sure they help others voice their concerns rather than becoming the voice of others? These are all questions that hopefully the next series of slides and our experience with this project will answer or help answer. So we've gone over what othering is already, viewing or treating a person or group as intrinsically different and alien to oneself. So one of the ways that I talk about this often within the context of peer services as we interact with, for example, the homeless services system or fundraisers. Our program has, our agency has a peer-run housing program. We consistently house 500 people every year. We move people right from the street into housing. And one of the reasons that that's successful is because as people move into housing in a single family neighborhood, that's just housing by right, they walk out of that door, they get to know the next door neighbor as a person and as a neighbor rather than as an other, okay? And the other thing is that homelessness and behavioral health diagnosis, a substance use diagnosis, those are aspects of a person's experience. They are not the defining characteristics of the person's identity. They are often finite episodes in people's long lives, all right? And so orienting to that is very important. So as we look at this internally, as we train organizations, we try to jump into that experience of being other. So we've done this in staff meetings, we've done this in in-person trainings. We did this throughout the course of a day with supervisors from Los Angeles County. And we had each person look into their own experience, right? Whether they were a person with quote unquote lived experience or not, we had them look into their own experience and identify an instance where they felt othered or left out, to create a sense of common experience, that this is something that human beings deal with and can access. And then we've talked about, what does that feel like? What did you want to do? What would you have liked from others? So that people understand the feeling of being othered themselves personally. And in that process, sharing those experiences collectively and creating a safe space to do that in a training format hearing those stories and sharing with each other how we feel hearing those stories creates a connectedness with our shared human experience in a way that can build a sense of allyship and relationships with people. So on top of that, we bring in a distinction between dialogue and debate. We do this organizationally and specifically within the context of supervision on both sides. And in all sides of that supervisory relationship, we're trying to orient toward dialogue. And we used this book from Daniel Yankelevich, The Magic of Dialogue, Transforming Conflict into Cooperation. And so what we see here are some key aspects of dialogue. In dialogue, we listen to learn, we speak to share from our own experience. The goal is to learn as much as possible from others, and we ask questions. So to compare this to debate, and I think I don't want to overgeneralize other people's experience. Anytime I turn on media, I see a lot of debate. I see debate on television. I think of Crossfire years ago. I think of those shows and living in a context of right and wrong. So debate assumes there's a right answer and I have it. Dialogue assumes that many people have pieces of the answer, and together we can craft a solution. Debate is combative. People attempt to prove the other side is wrong. Dialogue is collaborative. Participants work together toward common understanding. Debate is about winning. Dialogue is about exploring the common good. Debate entails listening to find flaws and make counter arguments. Dialogue entails listening to understand, to find meaning and agreement. In debate, I defend my assumptions as truth. In dialogue, I reveal my assumptions for reevaluation. In debate, I critique the other side's position. In dialogue, I re-examine all positions. In debate, I defend my own views against the views of others. In dialogue, I admit others' thinking can improve my own. In debate, I search for weakness in others' positions. In dialogue, I search for strength and value in others' positions. In debate, I seek a conclusion or vote that ratifies my position. In dialogue, I discover new options. So, how do we use that framework? We try internally to consistently orient programs, relationships, both internally and externally, within the parameters and the framework of dialogue, always reevaluating our position. And to support people in behaviors that support dialogue, the suspension of judgment while listening and speaking, our respect for differences, the suspension of role and status. I'm the supervisor, so that means blah, blah, blah. That may be the case. At the same time, if I am fixed to that role and status, I'm less likely to hear something outside that role and status. Balancing inquiry and advocacy and a focus on learning. So these things are particularly important in the supervision context and within the development of supervision within peer services, within the scaling of the peer workforce, dealing with the often seemingly conflicting perspectives of peer support specialists and clinicians within a given program or agency. So seeking debate or seeking dialogue over debate can reorient the focus and make a team much more cohesive and make for better services. So what do we do when we confront or when we see that stigma or bias? How do we jump into that and strengthen that relationship in a way that doesn't reinforce the stigma or the bias? So the things that we've identified there, these are the tools from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this is their Becoming an Ally training. So 1, get ready. 2, identify the behavior. 3, appeal to principles. 4, set limits. 5, find an ally and be an ally. And 6, be vigilant. So let's look at get ready. This is to orient us to the reality that these behaviors exist. And we want to prepare ourselves to be sensitive to them, to notice them, and to connect with people when they happen. Microaggressions will happen on a regular basis in a work environment. Get ready for them. How are we going to respond? So in that response, looking for open-ended questions is really important. So if somebody on a team where there's a peer specialist says something like, well, that person's just crazy, right? We've got to talk about that language in a way that creates a conversation and a dialogue rather than a debate. So open-ended questions. Why do you say that? How did you develop that belief? Are ways to start a conversation about it rather than creating the debate that's going to entrench people in defensiveness in their own position. In describing that behavior, we want to be specific in describing the behavior without labeling the person, right? Talking to the worker that said that person's just crazy, if we can describe the behavior in a way that doesn't label that person as a stigmatizing person or a biased individual, that's going to strengthen the relationship. Saying something like, my experience of that word is that people experience it and carry it around like an arrow in their heart. It can be, really hard. I know for me, as somebody with a mental health diagnosis, when I hear that word, it really feels personal. And it feels like somebody's judging me as something different than them in a way that makes me less than. So I can use disclosure to do that as an advocate and as an ally. If I don't have that experience, I can say, in my life, I have loving relationships with people who experience that word as a weapon. And so I'm wondering, that's not my experience of you. I don't know, is there another word? Like, I'm looking for what you're trying to describe. What is it that how are you defining crazy? Is crazy something that's not normal? Is crazy a bad decision? So trying to go in with an approach of inquiry to that comment is motivated by a desire to create a conversation and strengthen the relationship. Appealing to the principals, so calling on their higher principles, right? If I'm trying to connect with somebody, a coworker that's used harmful language, I can say, my experience of you is that you really strive for fairness and justice. And I know you as somebody that, fights against stigma and discrimination. So I'm wondering what you're describing here. Again, I'm trying to create a conversation. So words in terms of appealing to principles. People like to hear that they're fair-minded. People like to hear that they're considerate, that they're caring, that they're just, that they're tolerant, that they're accepting, they're broad-minded, unbiased, unprejudiced, moral, ethical. Most people would define themselves using at least one of these words. And if we appeal to the way they define themselves, we're more likely to be able to have a rich conversation than if we appeal to them or try to say, you're sexist, you're racist, you're ableist. So finding that principle that connects with their self-image is an important way to strengthen that connection. It's also important to set limits. We can't control other people. We can ask them to not use certain words, comments, not be around them. And that is fair. So saying something like, I know that you have a different experience with this. I experience those kinds of jokes as really harmful, and they cannot be in my presence. I just experience them as poison. So please, out of respect for our relationship, make sure that those comments aren't made around me. Right? I can own that as my issue without saying, you're an ableist for those kinds of jokes. And I need to follow through on my limits. If it happens again, I have the conversation. I can bring other people into the conversation. I can leave their presence. I'm going to report it, right? I can say, I'm concerned that this kind of language is harmful to the people that we're serving. And I need to let everybody know that this is happening. Finding an ally and being an ally. Seek out, and as an organization or an agency, cultivate a process and an environment where people can find like-minded people and create allies. After we speak up, if I have an ally, and I'll tell you, we were invited years ago as a peer-run organization to participate in a county-wide system to address homelessness that started on Skid Row. And we were the only peer-run organization. And our staff would go and provide input at that group, and they would come back and they would say, they hate me. This is awful. It's like I speak up as a peer and people turn their backs. So finding allies internally and externally to be able to have conversations and to support each other in that. I'm going into this environment. I know that it's an environment where I've got to talk about the efficacy of marginalized communities of peer services, and I need to talk to you before and after because it's really difficult. That's a process of self-care. So, you know, touching base with one's own ally before and after those events and those conversations develops resilience and increases not only personal resilience, but as I'm sharing my experience with allies across our community of care and our system, I'm building their resilience as well. So, and remember, you know, if I'm not the first voice to speak up against everyday prejudice, I can be the next voice that speaks up against it. So being vigilant is critical. Change happens slowly, and I can make a commitment to keep speaking up, and I can hold myself accountable and look at situations where I didn't speak up so that I can identify next time how I can speak up to greater effect. So those are, and again, this is a really quick overview of a detailed day-long training. We're trying to give you just the tools to put it in place as you will put it in place, however you need to, whether it's internal within supervision, whether it's external in partnership with others, dealing with systems, bringing into cultural competency practices within your scope of services in your agency. These we've found to be really effective tools. So questions, discussion. I'd like to hear from others about your practices here, and particularly around maybe the tools of being an ally and the framework for dialogue and debate. Do people have questions or observations? And if you go to the reaction part and actually raise your hand, push on the button, then you'll come to the top of the screen and I'll be able to see that the hand is raised.
If you're on your phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand or unraise your hand. I see Harry there.
Harry, thanks. I see you've got your hand up.
I like the dialogue idea, but I see limits with it in terms of the individual who just does not want to engage in dialogue. There are people that are so wedded to their belief systems that they're not willing to engage in any open-ended kind of inquiry whatsoever. And unfortunately, the only choice you have in dealing with those people is to withdraw, because any type of engagement by them is perceived as triggering or provocative, and it can sometimes become a safety issue. So I'd like your comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there are, within dialogue and debate and relationships, there's a continuum of relationships, right? There's the relationship of people who are coming for services, and they're going to get peer support, and we're going to support them without expecting them to have often one of the things that we often talk about is there's going to be transference. People are going to say that we're crappy and we're not doing anything and it's not okay. And the role of the peer support specialist and that agency is to try and find the truth in their experience and connect to that so that they feel supported and validated in their experience, rather than changing their mind or saying you're inappropriate. Then there's the relationship with a peer specialist themselves in a supervisory relationship. And on all sides of a supervisory relationship, there are going to be authority issues. And as we train individuals in practicing a framework of dialogue rather than debate, even when they are in situations where the other person is in a debate mode, they find it better for themselves when they stay in dialogue mode, right? It's less harmful for them. They feel more aligned with their empowerment, their efficacy, and they feel empowered by the conversation because they've been able to have, and they've been consistent in their training around dialogue. So that's some of our experience. Naomi, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was interested in knowing if you guys have a like a training session on specifically that, dialogue and debate. And I think it takes a lot of practice probably to, be able to recognize, oh, is this a dialogue or is this a debate? And so is that something that Share offers, or?
It's something that we will be offering. So we have, I will, you know what, I'm going to email. Brian, are you still able to put things in the chat if I email you something right now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to email you the draft manual for the supervision of the peer workforce. And then you can put that in the chat and people can get that. And so let me just really quick find that for everybody. Sorry. Here we go. So it's loading. Okay, here we go. All right, Brian, it's coming to you right now. It doesn't have a subject because I'm trying to get back over here to all of you. So, so that has the basic framework. Again, you're absolutely right. It takes practice. So what we're trying to do is build space, both internally and externally, where people can practice these things. So that original program with LA County was 40-hour training over the course of months, and we devoted like an entire day to this framework of dialogue, debate, and becoming an ally. And we had practice, we had scenarios. Building those things is important because we want to develop a practice of these things. Like at the most, I think the most empowering level, we want people to develop internally a practice of being in dialogue with others. And so part of the supervision training that we're going to be developing with Cal Mesa, where supervisors will get trained in supervision, will include practice in these techniques and concepts. Having said that, it's going to be through a learning management system. So we have to figure out how to give people that practice through a learning management system rather than like an in-person training. And it might be that we have cohorts of people going through that who support each other and practice outside those techniques. Harry, is that a new hand or the same hand from before? Okay. So thank
Jason,
you.
I I can't raise my hand. My Geek Squad is on this session, but he's not in the office to help me.
Well, I'm glad we can hear you. So go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to share that as I've had to unlearn a lot of things. My parents were born in the 1930s, right? And it takes a lot of courage and a lot of education and a lot of, like you were talking about, practice to even get comfortable enough to have the dialogue. But what I noticed was as I began to unlearn and relearn new things, that my dialogue came intuitively, and it wasn't pressured, and it didn't have to come from a place of you know, I'm pushing this out. It was something that I was able to say from my heart. And I think that the more practice, we just had a Jedi training at the Purpose of Recovery. And I just think that with the more practice and the more education and the more information that we provide to our peers and anybody challenged in this area, the more it's incorporated into our lived experience. And for me, I had to change it. I had to change my lived experience to something new because the old story didn't work.
Yeah.
And so
I really appreciate that comment, and thank you for sharing. I think, you know, an important aspect of that is the kind of parallel process in the role of peer support with disclosing and the process of dialogue, because in that practice of disclosing, inherently builds a kind of truth-seeking component where we're finding in our experience a way to share authentically in a way that connects with others. And that's fundamental for dialogue. So by orienting everybody in an organization in our system to the value of that and the importance of that, and then building throughout to this process of dialogue in a way that supports people in continued learning, right? It's really important because we've got to get out of this idea that there's just a right and a wrong. There's a process for growth. There's a process for connecting. There's a practice of disclosure. There's a practice of dialogue in a way that reinforces our ability to continue that practice. So well said, Susan. Thank you. I should have had us go into breakout rooms and done an exercise. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Naomi, is that a new hand?
Yes, I was just wondering, you know, around when that share might have the supervisor.
It's on Cal Mesa's schedule, so it is going to be after July. I know that. That's the best answer I have right now. So I'll tell you, you know, when we practiced this and we kind of broke out into groups and we had people kind of sit in an experience where they felt othered and write it down, and then share that experience of being othered. Those responses were, there's a wide continuum of experiences of being othered. And there was a sense of connectedness that allowed, I think, people to see a similarity in a way that they didn't see before, which really helped connect people across different job functions, different identities, different kind of self-definitions. So I think that that part of it is really important in that. And the other thing that we did with this was we looked at trauma too, which was a part of the project. And we looked at trauma from the perspective of both the ACEs survey, adverse childhood experiences. And so we did this with, hundreds of peer specialists and supervisors in LA County, and everybody took the survey, and almost everybody, supervisors who said they didn't have lived experience, scored as highly as people who were employed as peers on the adverse childhood experiences survey, right? And so we try to take this, this idea that lived experience and trauma is only in peer services and say, this is something that is part of what we're all dealing with. And how do we do this? And then we took it out of that framework, out of the ACEs framework, which is a series of questions. I think the version we used had 8 questions. And our experience of that is that those questions are often questions or experiences that people are repressing or denying, right? So if I ask somebody whether or not there was violence in their household, their parent might have beat their siblings every day, but they think, no, that was the neighbor because the neighbor did something else. Or if they were touched in an inappropriate way, they might be in denial. So we brought in something from a self-help support group that deals with trauma called Adult Children of Alcoholic and Dysfunctional Families. They call it their laundry list. And rather than looking at what happens in the past, the ACA laundry list looks at things, and I might be able to find it and just share it with everybody since we have some time. It looks at current behaviors of mine so that people can help. I think it was to Naomi's point of building a practice and being able to see things, and also to what Susan said. So let me get that up really quick because it's easily available. Okay, here we go. And you'll see the difference. Rather than asking about my past and things that I'm ashamed of, the laundry list, which is here, asks about present things. 14 traits of an adult child of an alcoholic, and they're dysfunctional families. We became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. We became approval seekers and lost our identity in the process. We are frightened by angry people and any personal criticism. We either became alcoholics, marry them, or both, or find another compulsive personality, such as a workaholic, to fulfill our sick abandonment needs. We live life from the viewpoint of victims and are attracted by that weakness in our love and friendship relationships. We have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility, and it is easier for us to be concerned with others rather than ourselves. This enables us to not look too closely at our own faults. So those 14 things are, while they're deep emotional frameworks, they allow us to look at things in our present behaviors in a way that's open and allows access across, whatever did or didn't happen in the past. So that's a resource as well for building that kind of practice and kind of cohesiveness across people in the organization. All right, we have another, okay, Harry, you have another hand, a physical hand this time.
I just wanted to say that question, what is your earliest childhood memory of being othered? That was very poignant to me because I didn't think in terms of that. I went through a lot of trauma as a child. But when you mentioned that question, I thought back to in kindergarten, they didn't know that I couldn't see. So it wasn't until late in the school term that they finally figured I needed to wear glasses. So I was being treated like I was, well, you know, the term mentally deficient. Back then they used a different word starting with the letter R.
Yeah.
And and then once I got the glasses, then I was continued to be othered because I'm the only kindergartner with glasses on. And it's just interesting that sometimes by framing the question, it can help you look back at a certain part of your life in a different perspective. So anyways, thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that you shared that experience, because I think it's so valuable in demonstrating that it's important to access those experiences, and accessing those experiences is an opportunity to create empathy with that situation. And it's because of that experience that one is often able to be an ally. If one can understand what it's like to be othered, one is better able to be an ally and to support somebody else who's going through that process. All right. Other questions or comments? And again, that you know, self-care is really important in going into those questions. Go into those questions with support. If you're going to go into those questions and you're going to look at that, like really, you know, seek understanding, and do so with the support of, you know, when we explored those questions, we had, you know, we had an environment where we were supporting each other in going through those questions. And so if people have questions about developing that kind of environment or how to approach that, I'm happy to share, you know, our process and how we did that.
I have another question.
Good.
Do they use some of these techniques to help veterans support each other in processing their experiences in order to alleviate their PTSD trauma? Because I see a lot of potential in this type of approach.
Yeah, I think in many ways, the practice of peer support for veteran communities is certainly deeper and longer than California's kind of statewide certification project. You know, the Veterans Administration had a peer support manual out like 10 years ago, and they have recognized the value in peer support. And in the you know, I don't know what specific trainings they're using. I do know that they are using peer support to go into that trauma and support each other around that trauma. And if anybody here, you know, has any experience with peer support in veterans organizations or communities, I'd be happy to, you know, learn more specifics about Harry's question.
Well, for me, I encounter a lot of veterans that are homeless.
Yeah.
And trying to put myself in a position where I could really be in their, you know, be better supportive of, be in a position where I can better understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
I'm constantly trying to engage and how to interact with them in a way that's respectful, but doesn't make assumptions about their experience, but yet I'm open to the inquiry.
Yeah, that's a good approach. I think, stepping into a situation with humility and with the idea of not making assumptions is really important. Like, for example, in our outreach for our housing program, we never assume anybody is homeless or wants housing. So if somebody is, they might be, asking for money at a gas station, and our team will, as they talk to them, we'll give them a flyer for our housing program and say, hey, by the way, if you run into anybody out here who is looking for housing, please give people these flyers because we can get people into housing immediately, right? That lets them be able to disclose their situation without seeing us as making a judgment about their situation. So practices like that, I think, are very helpful and create a strong non-judgmental kind of relationship. So it is 3:46. The next meeting, presentation's at 4 in this room. And thank you all for being here. I hope this was helpful, and you will get the slides and the video of the presentation will be posted on our website soon. Thank you, everybody.